What if I told you 300 farmers, armed with torches and jars, crushed a massive army without swinging a single sword? What if the most lopsided victory in history didn't come from strength, but from faith? And what if, at the end of it all, there was a divine signature hidden in plain sight? This isn't a legend. It's the real story of Gideon and the 300 warriors who defied logic, fear, and the odds. A story buried deep in the book of Judges, but its final twist still shocks scholars today. Why would God cut an army of 32,000 down to just 300? Why were the bravest fighters rejected, and who were the ones chosen instead? And what secret does the number 300 carry? A secret that reveals God's name in every victory. This story has action, tension, mystery, and a final revelation you won't see coming. It's bold, it's biblical, and it might just change how you see faith forever. So don't blink, don't skip, because what's revealed at the end will blow your mind. Let's uncover the victory of Gideon's tiny army, 300 against thousands. For 7 long years, Israel lived under the heavy weight of Midian's oppression. These weren't just difficult times. They were times of silence from heaven. Every prayer felt like it vanished into thin air. What was God doing? Why were they abandoned? The people of Israel had turned their backs on God, and now the land paid the price. Midian didn't just conquer them, they consumed everything in their path. Like locusts, they came during harvest time, stealing crops, crushing vines, and scattering livestock. Could this be the end for Israel? The Israelites, once free, now found themselves broken. The fields lay barren, and the barns were empty. Even the soil seemed to mourn. Where was the hope? The people of Israel had nowhere to turn. They took shelter in caves, hiding from the enemy. Strongholds were built not for war, but for survival. What did the future hold? Children no longer played in the sun. They learned to fear footsteps outside. Mothers hushed their cries, and fathers stared at their empty hands. There was no prophet, no sign from God, just silence. But even in the silence, something was stirring. Every year, they planted in hope, only to harvest in despair. Israel wasn't just poor. They were broken, carrying the weight of their sin and their shame. But even in the silence, God was at work. What was God preparing for Israel? He wasn't sending armies or swords. He was preparing a plan that would begin in the most unlikely place, a winepress. And in that moment of quiet, a hero was about to emerge. In that winepress, hiding from the Midianites, God called a man named Gideon. Gideon was not a warrior. He was just a farmer, terrified and hiding from the enemy. But an angel appeared to him and called him Mighty Warrior. What could this man, hiding in fear, possibly do? The words didn't match the man, but the call was clear. Gideon was doubtful. He asked for a sign, a miracle, to prove that God was truly with him. He placed a fleece on the ground and asked God to make it wet with dew while the ground stayed dry. And God answered. Could it really be true? The next night, Gideon asked for the fleece to stay dry while the ground was wet, and God answered again. This simple act of faith, this willingness to listen and trust, marked the beginning of a journey that would change Israel's fate. Gideon was beginning to understand. The impossible was within reach. Gideon, now convinced that God was with him, gathered an army. 32,000 men rallied to him, but God said, "Too many. If you win, they'll think it's because of their own strength." So the army was reduced, first to 10,000 and finally to just 300 men. Why only 300? What was God's plan? God wanted to show that the victory would not come from numbers or strength, but from His power alone. The 300 men with no swords, no shields, only trumpets, clay jars, and torches followed God's strange plan. They surrounded the enemy camp in the middle of the night. Could this strange strategy really work? Then, at the signal, they shattered the jars, blew their trumpets, and shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The enemy, in a state of panic, turned on each other, fighting in chaos and confusion. There was no battle. The enemy fled, and Israel pursued. The victory wasn't just in the enemy's defeat, but in the way God worked through them. The land that had been stolen was now being reclaimed. The Israelites didn't lift a sword, but they trusted in God's plan. It was a victory through obedience, not strength. But even with this miraculous victory, Gideon's greatest test was yet to come. After the initial victory over the Midianites, Gideon did not rest. Recognizing the need to consolidate their triumph, he rallied additional tribes of Israel, Naphtali, Asher, Manasseh, and notably Ephraim, to pursue the fleeing Midianite forces. This swift action aimed to ensure that the enemy would not regroup and pose a future threat. As the Israelites chased the remnants of the Midian army, the Ephraimites played a crucial role. They successfully captured and executed 2 Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeb, at strategic river crossings. This decisive action effectively crippled the enemy, leaving them leaderless and in disarray. However, the aftermath of the battle brought unforeseen challenges for Gideon. Upon their return, the Ephraimites confronted Gideon, expressing anger and frustration. They accused him of not involving them in the initial stages of the battle, feeling sidelined and undervalued. Their criticism was sharp, and it could have led to severe internal strife, threatening the unity and future stability of Israel. Gideon, however, demonstrated remarkable diplomacy and wisdom in his response. Instead of meeting their accusations with defensiveness or indignation, he chose a path of humility and tact. He praised the Ephraimites for their significant achievement in capturing Oreb and Zeb, asserting that their victory was greater than his own initial triumph. Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? Gideon asked them, referring to his own clan. He continued, God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. What was I able to do in comparison with you? This acknowledgement of their success and the importance of their role served to soothe the wounded pride of the Ephraimites. By elevating their contribution and honoring their essential part in the victory, Gideon averted a potential conflict that could have fractured the fragile alliance of the Israelite tribes. His ability to navigate this delicate situation not only preserved unity among the tribes, but also reinforced his leadership and the respect he commanded among his people. This incident teaches a vital lesson about the importance of diplomacy and humility in leadership. Gideon's handling of the situation reflects a profound understanding. True leadership is not just about winning battles, but also about forging and maintaining unity. His wise words and acknowledgement of the Ephraimites' feelings ensured that internal peace was maintained, paving the way for a stronger, united front against future threats. In the grand narrative of Israel's deliverance from Midian, the tactical victory on the battlefield was crucial, but the diplomatic triumph among the tribes was equally significant. It highlighted that in the quest for peace and stability, the battles fought within are just as important as those fought against external foes. What happens when victory isn't enough? Gideon's battle was far from over, and the hardest choices were yet to come. How did he handle betrayal from his own people? After a miraculous victory, the battle was far from over for Gideon and his 300 loyal warriors. Weary and hungry, they pressed on, crossing the Jordan River in relentless pursuit of the Midianite kings Zebah and Zalmunna and their remaining 15,000 soldiers. It was a race not just against the enemy, but against time and their own physical limits. During the pursuit, Gideon approached the towns of Sukkoth and Penuel, seeking sustenance for his exhausted men. However, instead of support, the townspeople met him with scorn, mocking his efforts and doubting his ability to capture the Midianite kings. Fueled by their derision, Gideon vowed stern retribution against these towns for their lack of faith and support once the battle was won. True to his word, Gideon executed a surprise attack that shattered the remaining Midianite forces, capturing Zebah and Zalmunna. The victory was decisive, but Gideon's mission was not yet complete. On his journey back, he fulfilled his vow. He punished the leaders of Sukkoth with thorns and briars and destroyed the tower of Penuel, executing the men who had scorned him. This act of retribution was not out of vengeance, but a stern message about unity and support during times of national crisis. The final act of Gideon's campaign was deeply personal. Upon confronting Zebah and Zalmunna, Gideon learned that they had killed his brothers at Tabor. Intent on justice, he ordered his eldest son, Jether, to execute the kings. However, the boy, young and frightened, hesitated. With a heavy heart but a resolved spirit, Gideon took up the sword himself, ending the lives of Zebah and Zalmunna. This act was not just about revenge, it was about securing peace and ensuring that the horrors inflicted by Midian would never revisit Israel. Gideon's actions brought peace to Israel for the next 40 years, but they also laid bare the heavy burdens of leadership. His decisions, though harsh, were aimed at preserving unity and demonstrating the consequences of betrayal and cowardice. Through his leadership, Israel learned the importance of solidarity and the severe costs of division during wartime. This narrative isn't just a tale of ancient warfare, it's a poignant reminder of the complexities of leadership. It underscores that the path to peace often requires tough decisions that can weigh heavily on the hearts of those who lead. Gideon's story teaches us about the balance between justice and mercy, the necessity of support in times of adversity, and the enduring impact of leadership on a nation's fate. As we reflect on his journey, we see a man who was thrust into a role that tested every fiber of his being, a leader who made irreversible choices in the pursuit of peace and stability for his people. God often challenges our human logic, and this is exactly what we see in the story of Gideon. God didn't want Gideon to rely on numbers or strength. He didn't need a large army. He wanted Gideon to trust in him. The key lesson here is simple yet powerful. True strength comes from obedience and faith in God, not from our own resources or power. Gideon had no choice but to trust God's plan, even when it didn't make sense. In life, we often feel the pressure to solve challenges by ourselves. We rely on our own strength, our own abilities, and our own resources, forgetting that the answer lies in trusting in God's plan. Think about it. How many times have we faced difficult situations where it seemed impossible to move forward? We might feel overwhelmed by everything we don't have and wonder how we could ever succeed. Yet, when we decide to trust in a bigger plan, a plan we might not fully understand, the path becomes clearer. Things fall into place in ways we never expected. Gideon's story is a powerful reminder of this truth. He was just an ordinary man hiding in fear, but God called him to do something extraordinary. And at first, the plan didn't make sense. God told him to reduce his army from 32,000 soldiers to just 300 men. In human terms, this seemed like a recipe for failure. But in God's eyes, it was the perfect number. Here's the real takeaway. Victory does not come from our own strength or resources. It comes from trusting in God and following His plan, even when it seems illogical or impossible. Gideon had to trust God even when everything seemed to go against what he would have naturally done. It wasn't about what Gideon could do in his own power, but about trusting God to do the impossible. We've all been in situations where we don't have all the answers. Maybe you're facing a difficult decision right now, whether it's related to your job, relationships, or personal goals. There might be fear and uncertainty, but just like Gideon, the key is trusting God's plan even when you can't see the full picture. Gideon didn't understand why God wanted him to reduce the army, but he trusted that God's plan was better than his own. And when we step out in faith, even when we don't fully understand, we often see God move in miraculous ways. This doesn't mean that everything will be easy. It simply means that when we trust God, He leads us through challenges and to victories that we never imagined possible. In Gideon's case, God didn't need a large army to win the battle. He didn't need an overwhelming force to defeat Midian. What God needed was Gideon's obedience and trust. Once Gideon placed his faith in God, victory was secured, not through strength or numbers, but through faith and obedience. The amazing thing is that when we trust God's plan, we realize that our victories don't always come from our own strength. They come from our willingness to follow His lead, even when it doesn't make sense in our own minds. True strength comes from trusting God's timing and His plan, and that's when the impossible becomes possible. We often overlook the deeper meaning behind Gideon's victory. The real question isn't just how they won, but why God chose only 300 men. What made these 300 so special, and why did God reduce Gideon's army so dramatically? Let's break it down. These 300 men weren't the strongest or the bravest. In fact, many of them were ordinary, unremarkable men, just like you and me. Yet, they were the ones chosen to carry out the impossible. This wasn't about strength in numbers or physical power. It was about obedience. God wanted to show that victory comes through faith, not through our own ability. When you face your own battles, are you focusing on your strengths, or are you trusting in something greater? This is a powerful lesson. Sometimes the smallest actions and the least likely people are the ones God uses to accomplish His will. In Gideon's case, those 300 men weren't chosen for what they had, but for their willingness to trust in God's plan. Now, let's look at the next part of Gideon's journey, how he proved that victory is often found in obedience, not in force. The number 300 wasn't chosen by chance. In Jewish culture, the number 300 carries profound meaning. It's not just a random number assigned to Gideon's army. It's linked to the Hebrew letter Shin, which represents the name of God. Let that sink in for a moment. This number, so simple yet so powerful, was a divine choice made by God. It wasn't just about reducing the army to a manageable size. It was about pointing directly to God's power, His authority, and the fact that victory would not come from human strength, but from His divine intervention. Now, think about this. God could have chosen 10,000 men, or even 32,000 as originally planned. But instead, He selected just 300. Why 300? Why this seemingly insignificant number? It wasn't because of their physical strength or strategic skills. It was because God was about to reveal something extraordinary. This is the secret behind the number 300. The victory was never about Gideon's might nor his strategy. It was about God's name being revealed in every victory. In the book of Judges, God specifically chose Gideon's army of 300 men to show that His name, and His name alone, is what grants true victory. God wanted the people of Israel, and all of us, to know that their salvation came not from their own strength, but from God's divine will. Think about your own struggles in life. How often do we rely on our own strength, resources, and abilities to overcome challenges? We believe that if we work hard enough, fight enough, or plan enough, we can win. But Gideon's story teaches us that sometimes the true victory comes not from our own power, but from trusting in something far greater than ourselves. The power of God is what leads us through the most impossible circumstances. Gideon's army of 300 men was never about their size or strength. It was about their faith, their obedience, and their willingness to trust in God's plan. The 300 men were not the most skilled or the most powerful. They were ordinary men who had faith in an extraordinary God. And through their faith, God worked wonders. Think about the battles you face today. We often look at our own resources and feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge. We feel weak, inadequate, and alone in our struggles. But God shows us that even the smallest efforts, when coupled with faith in Him, can lead to victories beyond what we could ever imagine. Sometimes God chooses the least likely people to carry out His greatest works. It's not about having the right qualifications, the right resources, or the right skills. It's about having faith in God's plan, trusting in His timing, and allowing Him to use us, no matter how small or insignificant we may feel. Gideon's victory over the Midianites is proof of that. Now, let's dive deeper into what this teaches us about God's power and our role in His plan. Gideon was a reluctant leader. He was a man of little faith at first, hiding in fear. But when he trusted in God's plan, everything changed. His faith, and the faith of the 300 men who stood with him, was the key to their victory. What does this mean for us? It means that we don't have to rely on our own strength to overcome life's challenges. We don't have to have all the answers, all the resources, or all the power. What we need is faith. Faith that God will show up, faith that His plan is greater than ours, and faith that, no matter how small we may feel, God can use us to do great things. The number 300 is a reminder that God doesn't need a large army to win. He doesn't need overwhelming force to defeat the enemy. What He needs is our obedience, our trust, and our willingness to follow His lead. In our lives, God can take our little faith, our small actions, and use them to accomplish great things. As we reflect on the story of Gideon and the number 300, let's remember that our victories don't come from our own strength or resources. They come from God. And even when we feel weak, inadequate, or powerless, we can take heart knowing that God's power is greater than anything we face. So, the next time you feel overwhelmed by life's challenges, remember the number 300. Remember that even the smallest things, when done with faith and trust in God, can lead to miraculous victories. It's not about the size of the army, it's about the strength of the one leading us. And when God is on our side, there's nothing impossible. Gideon's victory wasn't because of his strength, but because of his faith. He trusted God's plan, and that made all the difference. When faced with an impossible situation, Gideon didn't rely on his own power. He trusted in God's guidance even when it didn't make sense. His victory proves that faith is more powerful than any physical strength. God doesn't need anything grand from us. He just needs us to trust and obey. It's not about having the best resources or being the strongest. It's about believing in His plan, even when we can't see the full picture. When we trust in God, we tap into a power greater than ourselves. Gideon's story shows that even the smallest act of faith can lead to monumental victories. It's a reminder that God is with us, even when the odds are against us. So, as you reflect on your own life, think about the challenges you face. Are you relying on your own strength, or are you ready to trust in God's plan? Even when it seems impossible, remember, God is greater than any obstacle.